welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of a fascinating book about a fascinating historical figure, one that I was so excited to learn about, and I am so excited to have this conversation. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course. My name is Dane Huckelbridge, and my book is called Queen of All Mayhem, and it's a biography of the outlaw BELLE STARR.
Belle Starr. So I considered myself a sort of mild to moderate fan of Western history. I was a huge Deadwood fan about 20 years ago now, which is really horrible to realize as I say it out loud. But I had never heard of Belle Starr. And that is one of the things that you talk about in the book, that she has been eclipsed by other figures from her time who perhaps had, fewer credentials, as it were, than she did. So, could you just start by telling us a little bit about her and how you happened into her story?
Sure. Well, I'll start how I happened into the story because that's kind of interesting. When I was a little kid, and as to how true this is there's some ambiguity. I talk about this a little bit in the book, so I won't give away the endings. But as a kid, my mom often told us that we were distantly related to Belle Starr. Which, like I said, I look into this in the book because I wasn't sure how true that was, but it was just this little tidbit that you'd mention it in a school family tree report or something like that, but I didn't think much of it. And I was talking to my editor a few years ago, and it casually came up in conversation, and he immediately became very interested. And you know, after talking a little, we realized, wow, this could actually make a great book. And I looked into it, and it really hadn't been done recently or that thoroughly. Like she was, as you said, she's been a little bit forgotten, a little bit left out. You hear about Calamity Jane or Annie Oakley or Big Nose Kate, these other female Western figures, and she was forgotten, which is a shame because she was legit. I mean, she truly was an outlaw and a gunslinger and a smuggler, and got into all sorts of problems with the law, both federal authorities and tribal authorities. But she was forgotten a little bit, specifically after World War II. I think the first half of the 20th century, those decades after her death, she was a little bit more of a household name. And for reasons I can get into if you'd like, I think the second half of the 20th century she was written out of the script a little bit and forgotten. So this book seemed like a great opportunity to reintroduce her to the American people.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, and her story is told within so many fascinating contexts in a really interesting sort of transitional moment for the country too. Gosh, I have so many questions about that, but I'm going to keep it focused on her for now. One of the things that you return to quite frequently in the book is that, she came from a sort of a stable upbringing. She had a comfortable life laid out ahead of her. She didn't really need to live the outlaw life, but she did. And it's a big question, why? So, could you talk a little bit about that without, giving away too much of your book? Like, how did she find herself in this life?
Sure. Well, I think there's two answers to that question. And as to why the outlaw life appealed to her, I think that's the broader issue of just at that time and place, she really felt restricted as a woman. And she was searching this equality, this chance for self-realization, self-determination that on the frontier at that time, I think was very hard for her to find. And what she couldn't do through legal means, she decided to do through illegal ones. And being an outlaw gave her a kind of freedom and liberty and the chance to pursue things that were, virtually impossible for her in law-abiding society. So I think that's the broader reason. Specifically, how she segued into this outlaw life. I think one of the big factors was the Civil War. And her family and many of the young men in her cohort, she was originally from southwestern Missouri, were Confederate bushwhackers, Confederate guerrillas who kind of rose up against, when the Union troops came in and occupied Missouri. And when the war ended, they weren't necessarily treated as regular, uniform wearing Confederates. They're still seen as kind of outlaws. And so many of them, they gained all these, pretty dangerous skills fighting this guerrilla insurgency. They're handy with guns. They were used to holding up stagecoaches, robbing at gunpoint, arms depots, all this sort of stuff. They had these already had these guerrilla skills that they learned as insurgents. And suddenly they many of them had to flee Missouri because there was this very real threat of them being prosecuted after the end of the Civil War. And then on top of that, the economy was in ruins. I mean, Missouri was just a wasteland after the Civil War. And many of them drifted down to Texas, where there was this growing community of Missouri transplants. And there on the Wild West, many of these young men without any gainful employment and with all these dangerous skills turned to the one thing they could to make a living readily, and that was their guns. So you have this whole class of outlaws. And when you look at Belle Starr, all of these not all, but I'd say most of the outlaws she befriended immediately after and kind of ran with, many of them were guerrillas. And she herself had helped served as, I guess you could say, a Civil War spy, helping her brother as a teenage girl in Missouri, which is a fascinating story, unto itself. And so, yeah, this transition to criminal life was made possible by these men she befriended. It was related to whatever after the war. And Jim Reed, her first husband, had also been, a guerrilla insurgent in Missouri, and she kind of got swept along a bit. I think she was very enthusiastic, though. I don't want to make it seem like it was sort of against her will. I think she became a very enthusiastic participant in some of his criminal exploits, along with Jesse James, Cole Younger, this sort of cohort of outlaws. She was friends with him, and she started initially kind of peripherally, almost as a sidekick. I think she kind of served lookout in a few instances, for example, the famous Grayson robbery. But eventually, she would decide she didn't like playing second fiddle to these outlaw men, and she took it upon herself to become something of a gangster and then kind of a gang lord, a crime lord in her own right, and leading her own gang, where they did a lot of horse theft, but also other things too. I think they're involved in armed robberies and whiskey smuggling. It truly was like an organized crime ring, a little mafia, and she was I guess you could say high ranking, possibly even the leader of it, depending how you look at it.
Yes. Yeah, the general sort of soldier to outlaw pipeline, as it were, kind of echoes the medieval knight errant in a little way. Like once that mercenary money dries up, how are you going to make make your living? Um, and her exploits are just so fascinating. And there's a lot of tragedy in her life too, because that brother you mentioned, she loses pretty young, and she loses more than one husband. You talk a little bit about these personal life things and how they sort of, bleed into her exploits, as it were. I'm really curious about the research that you did, what sort of sources you looked at, what sort of reading you did.
Sure, it was a wide range of sources. Quite a few newspaper articles from the era, and the Oklahoma Historical Society was extremely helpful with that. They helped me get a lot of this stuff together because they've got a great archive. So a lot of newspaper articles came into play, old court records, kind of almost minutes from the court cases, along with the journalism that accompanied it around her trial. Some of these old kind of like county histories, many of which are digitized, so you can find them online. But these old histories from the 1800s of these different counties where she lived provided some context. For the Civil War period, when she was serving as a teenage spy, there's a few compendiums, these collections of remembrances from Jasper County where she lived. So those came in handy. And and then there were some books that you could use almost as primary sources. Shortly after her death, there were a few of these big books written by Western characters who kind of knew her or were in the same milieu that would account these stories, which came in very handy, but also, and I say this right from the get-go, when you're talking about the Wild West, you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt because you can't necessarily rely on newspaper stories that are greatly exaggerated at times, even records. And a perfect example is in her second marriage, Belle Starr lied about her age on her marriage certificate to appear younger. And I think she actually kind of fibbed about that to her husband at the time and she was marrying. So, even marriage records things like that birth records, census records, you can't necessarily take as gospel. You have to take everything with a grain of salt. And I say, like, telling these stories, it's a bit like painting a portrait. It's sort of, you're using as much information you can get to kind of paint the most accurate picture that you can, while acknowledging that there's some guesswork, some interpretation, and also just the fact that she dealt in organized crime. And I always say part of the reason they had to bust Al Capone, eventually the feds, on tax evasion charges, because it was so hard to get proof of what was going on in the shadows. And much of what Belle Starr did go on in the shadows. We know some about her criminality because she actually was arrested and charged with crimes, some of which she was able to beat, but she did actually go to prison for one of them. So it's taking all these sources and trying to figure out exactly what was going on.
Was there anything that you found in those sources that really surprised you or that changed the story you were telling or made you realize you were telling a different flavor of story than you thought?
I think one thing that I found interesting was that when you read the newspaper articles that came out around her trial, you realize that she, on the local level, she was sort of a phenomenon. It was, because it raises the question, like, she was a sort of this female crime figure. How, first of all, was that actually true? And second of all, how usual was that? Did that seem exceptional at the time? And when you read some of these newspaper articles covering her trial, you realized she was regarded, commonly regarded as sort of this gang leader, as sort of they refer to her as like outlaw queen or queen of these outlaws. And it was a sensation. They talk about how the courtroom was packed for her trials with people all trying to catch a glimpse of this outlaw queen, this bandit queen. And she played the part. I mean, she had this unique style, which makes her such a fascinating character. She was wearing these long black velvet, riding dresses and these hats pinned up with elaborate feathers, and always had her six shooter, sometimes one, sometimes multiple, on her. And yeah, I mean, she's practically made for Hollywood, just the way she was, and she was a sensation, and people in town wanted to catch a glimpse of her. She was well known. She was regarded as like an outlaw and a troublemaker, and I think she was feared to an extent too. There's one record, one of the witnesses in her trial was sort of cooperating with authorities to testify against her, and she engaged in flat out witness intimidation. She basically threatened to waylay his road, that is to say, when he was walking home one night, kill him or shoot at him. And apparently, it looks like she did. It's unclear if the shot missed or if it was just an intimidation tactic and just a gunshot. But at some point, the witness said he was walking home and heard a gunshot and kind of galloped away. So yeah, it's that I'd say that's one of the things I found interesting and a little surprising, and kind of confirmed the thesis going into that she was legit. She was like truly was a hardened criminal and known and feared in that area around kind of the Dallas area and in what was then called Indian Territory, but modern day Oklahoma.
Hmm. I'm so glad that you mentioned Indian Territory because I was really fascinated by her integration into Cherokee society via one of her husbands. Can you talk a little bit about her relationship to the Cherokee?
Sure. She had this sort of ongoing, previous to getting married, relationship with the Cherokee Nation, because many of these Confederate rebels, Confederate guerrillas she'd ridden with and palled around with, they'd fought alongside Cherokees for the Confederate cause, and many of them they would often use the Cherokee Nation or use what was then Indian Territory as a hideout in the winter, because it became much more dangerous and harder to live off the land. So there was this, and after the war, this relationship with the Cherokees, particularly certain families like the Starrs, but it switched to kind of organized crime. So they were using them to fence cattle, like rustled cattle, stolen horses, smuggle whiskey, things like that. And you had this relationship between the Confederate guerrillas and some of these Cherokee families that fought for the Confederacy that started to take the flavor of criminality afterwards. And so I think Belle, I think her first husband, Jim Reed, spent a lot of time there, was involved in whiskey smuggling and things like that. And she would go with him, and she came to know the place and the people, and particularly this relationship with the Starrs, who was this really fascinating family that had once upon a time been political rebels in their own kind of Cherokee Civil War struggles, and had also drifted more towards kind of organized crime after that. And at one point after her first husband was killed, and then her second husband, the one where she lied on the marriage certificate, that was disastrously short. I wouldn't be surprised if he found out her real age and that caused some conflict, but I really don't know. But that marriage only lasted a couple of weeks, I think. And after that, she just cut a beeline straight to the Cherokee Nation and married Sam Starr, the son of Tom Starr, who is this legendary figure in Cherokee history. And that was her entree into becoming something of a honorary citizen or adopted member of the tribe. And that's how she kind of got involved with some of the Starr family's criminal dealings, and eventually, kind of worked her way up and developed, put together her own little gang that she ran out of Younger's Bend, which was her and Sam Starr's ranch that they, little settlement that they occupied there.
Reading her story really, I think, complicates a lot of the easy narratives that we tell ourselves about history. Most of all, sort of, I think the impulse to kind of claim her as like a proto-feminist or, somebody who was rallying for women's rights, which was not quite true. She was fighting the patriarchy, as you say, at some points, but not really fighting a battle for all women, as it were. Could you talk a little bit about taking history on its own terms, trying to avoid putting like the sort of modern lens to view everything through, if that makes sense?
Sure, sure. I think and this is true in history in general, but specifically when you're talking about the West, it's when you actually start digging in and going through primary sources and trying to introduce, you realize that it was things were so much complicated than just the conceptions we have, both pop culture and historical. There's so many tropes and kind of cliches surrounding the West, some of which were very true to the extent that even surprised me. Like I always had this kind of feeling that the kind of violence was gunfights, stuff like that was exaggerated a bit. And then reading this, realize, wow, not only was it not exaggerated, I mean, just look at how many of people close to Belle died from gunfights, including herself. She eventually would be gunned down. And you realize like there's certain things that are true or even truer than perceptions, but then you also start to realize how complex things are. And when you look at the history of the Cherokee Nation, the social dynamics were unbelievably complex. You had Native Americans, African Americans, white sharecroppers, all sort of negotiating this space together, and it's just really, really a complex uh, and compelling. I mean, it's fascinating reading about this, but you just start to realize it's much more complicated than you realized, and it's hard sometimes to understand how these things worked. And in regards to Belle Starr, whether you could categorize as a feminist or not, I think it's a tricky question, because I think if you'd actually, assuming she had like a conception of the term, if you'd asked her, she probably would have said no. She would have said, I don't care about, I'm not in it for any cause. I'm an outlaw. Like, she was very proud of being a gangster and an outlaw. That's how she identified. I think more so than as as a woman. She felt the companionship of other outlaws, and she was in it for herself. She was certainly not out for any social cause or to help other people. Quite the contrary. But at the same time, and I say this, well, you don't want to necessarily glamorize a nation's criminals and outlaws, or champion them. I think it is worth recognizing trailblazers. And in that regard, she was definitely a trailblazer. And she definitely accomplished something that was remarkable for anyone at that time, but specifically a woman to rise to these ranks of organized crime, and also specifically in the Cherokee Nation. And yeah, and in doing that, I think she set an example or blazed a trail of someone who was doing something really exceptional, remarkable, and having a position of power and influence at a time when very few people like her were given access to that, and she did it on her own terms. So I think that's, as a trailblazer, she's very important and critical in understanding American history. But at the same time, she was not a role model. She was not someone to emulate, and you have to be careful glorifying her exploits too much, because she was a gangster and proud of it.
Absolutely. You hinted before about some of the reasons that you think maybe her image sort of waned in the latter half of the 20th century. Could you get into that a little bit?
Certainly. And I think it has to do with just the cultural environment that you had in America in the post-war years and during the Cold War, in regards to the role of the Western as a genre, and also the roles that women had within Western. And when you look at the American Westerns, not spaghetti Westerns, the European ones, which I think are different, but the American Westerns, they really served as sort of a way of retelling the creation myth of America, of Western expansion, a kind of American exceptionalism. And, you know, in the context of the Cold War, that was, you know, you could see them, they were entertaining, but they were kind of like propaganda in a way. And the role, you know, that there wasn't really a lot of room for moral ambiguity or, you know, characters who are neither good nor bad per se, or who were in it just for money. In you know, spaghetti westerns, yes, but in these Americans, it was always sort of, you know, these heroes who are pure of heart, fighting either quote unquote civilizing the West by fighting, you know, Native Americans who were uncooperative with these efforts, or outlaws who were materialistic and in it just for gain, and sort of, you know, setting this example of, you know, morally pure, unambiguous American exceptionalism. And the women in these westerns usually had these roles as kind of paragons of civilization. It was often like a school teacher from back east who arrived, or fiance, or sometimes like a rancher's daughter who, you know, was fighting the good fight on her father's behalf. These types of tropes, and Belle Starr just did not fit into that. She was the West as it really was. I mean, she was, you know, she was propelled by, to a certain extent, the thrill of violence and greed. I think she was sexually very liberated. She kind of she had a history of doing whatever she wanted and with whomever she wanted and taking the lead. And, you know, what, like a story I love was that one of her lovers who she later married was a Cherokee man who was 15 years her younger, who she forced him apparently to change his name to hers when they got married. And just within the context of westerns and how women were portrayed in them in these sort of post-war Cold War years, you see there was no place for her, you know, and like even say like probably censors wouldn't have allowed an accurate depiction of her life. And yeah, and I think that's why she was written out of the script a lot. It was much easier to fit these other female characters into the Western canon. And because many of the others, they didn't really have like the criminal bona fides that she did. They were sort of invented characters where she was legitimate. She was a true hardened criminal who did things that would have been seen as scandalous at the time and even today, and she was unapologetic about it. And there just wasn't really a place for her in the Western the Westerns of the era.
Yeah, she doesn't really quite fit the sort of manifest destiny narrative that those early Westerns are establishing. That's a really good point. Gosh, this has been so interesting, and I am so thankful that you came to talk to us about it. What is on your horizon? What's next for you? Are you writing right now?
Next, let's see. Well, I do write fiction on the side, so I've been working on a fiction manuscript, and I'm making a few revisions, and hopefully it'll go out with that. See if it works. And then for nonfiction, because I love writing these historical books. I have a couple of ideas, but nothing firm yet. And I think after this the book comes out, I'm going to start focusing a little more on that. So nothing firm on the horizon, but once this is out in the world, I've got to get back to get back to work, get back to the desk, and get to it. So we'll see.
Nice. Well, Godspeed on all your projects. I'm very excited to see what the next books bring. Yeah, I am very excited to recommend this to our patrons. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out The Queen of All Mayhem, The Blood-Soaked Life and Mysterious Death of Belle Starr, the Most Dangerous Woman in the West. What a great title. It sounds like one of the posters that you would see of her, in the big block text. It's wonderful. It's such a good read. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for your books. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.